Hello, everyone. Welcome to Right Wing Rising and to part 5 of my 240ToWin series. Please be sure to like this video down below before you are finished watching and to subscribe to the channel if you are new. So in my last video in this series, we talked about the Indiana primaries that happened this past Tuesday. And there were some mixed results, you might say, from those elections, and I will cover those in a coming video. But instead, today, we will be talking about more primary elections that will be taking place across several states this coming Tuesday, May 14th. And just like I did for the Indiana primary races, I want to give you a preview of these upcoming elections. So without further ado, let's look at the 10 most important primary races happening this Tuesday. And starting off at number 10 is the West Virginia Secretary of State election. The current incumbent, Mac Warner, is a very solid Secretary of State in West Virginia. Now he is retiring to run for governor of the state, and his brother, Chris Warner, is running to take his place. And he is the former chair of the West Virginia Republican Party, and he seems to be the best of the candidates in the race for the Republican nomination. He also is the executive director of the West Virginia Economic Development Authority. He is a former Trump appointee. I'm usually a little bit leery about political dynasties and nepotism in government. That usually doesn't lead to many good things. But I think given the alternatives, he might be a good option here. Ken Reed is also a candidate for this position. He is a former state delegate in the State House of Representatives of West Virginia. And he also seems like a solid candidate. The one candidate I would stay away from is Doug Scaff. He is the former Democratic minority leader of the West Virginia House of Delegates, who recently switched parties to run in this race, which obviously smells very, very fishy. So he is definitely the candidate to vote against. I think if Chris Warner or Ken Reed were to be the nominee, that would be very solid. In the most recent poll, which is only as of November 2023, but Chris Warner was leading with 20%. With the other candidates being in the single digits, but this poll also had over 60% of the vote undecided. So it's really anyone's ball game, and the Secretary of State positions are actually much more important than people usually give them credit for and pay attention to, because they are more under the radar in the state government. So this is a race to pay attention to see the quality of the candidate that will be the Republican nominee. Moving over to number 9, we have the West Virginia Attorney General election, and this is a two-horse race between J.B. McCuskey, the current West Virginia state auditor, and Michael Stewart, who is the state senator from the 7th District. And my personal pick in this race is going to be Michael Stewart. J.B. McCuskey has been endorsed by the West Virginia Chamber of Commerce and just seems a little bit more establishmentarian in my mind, while Michael Stewart has a more solid issues page when you look at his campaign website, and the things that he would focus on are much more comprehensive and wide-ranging, especially when it comes to crime and cracking down on the opioid crisis, which is very important. And we can also see that Michael Stewart has conversely been endorsed by Matthew Whitaker, the former acting U.S. Attorney General under Trump, and the West Virginia Coal Association. And the polling is very close, but again has not been updated since the end of 2023, with McCuskey leading Stewart 16 to 11%, which is obviously very low, with almost 70% undecided. So this is really anyone's race, and I really hope Michael Stewart pulls it out. I think he'd be the better choice for AG in West Virginia for law and order and the war on drugs. Now, the next two most important primary races happening this Tuesday can be found in the state of Nebraska, happening in the 2nd and 3rd districts. Looking first to the 2nd district, we can see Don Bacon, the incumbent congressman in this seat, is a very notorious moderate, which is a little bit more forgivable than most rhinos because he is in a Democrat-leaning and a Democrat-swinging district, but he still takes it a little bit too far sometimes, and this is also a seat that Republicans still can eke out. He's been favored to go down the last couple cycles, but has managed to hold on. And now his opponent he is facing, Dan Frey. Now he is a former member of the Nebraska Republican Party State Committee, and he has been endorsed by the state party in Nebraska, and has built a decent amount of momentum down the stretch. As we can see here, Don Bacon has gotten all of these people's endorsements, while Dan Frey has been endorsed by the Nebraska Republican Party. So he doesn't have many endorsements, but that's a big one. It carries a lot of clout in the state. Still, Don Bacon is leading by a significant margin in the polls against Dan Frey by about 50 points, although with a decent amount of undecided voters remaining in these polls, and outspending Dan Frey like 100-1, probably more than that, because he's spent almost $2 million so far, while Dan Frey hasn't even spent $100K on this race. So it will be very interesting to see if the results of this primary do surprise some people with how close they are. So it's one to keep an eye on, and it would be kind of funny to see Don Bacon get primaried out. Like I said, he's from a Democrat district, but he doesn't have to play the moderate rhino card. Really, as hard as he does, it's really annoying, because he almost goes out of his way to stop Republican agenda items sometimes, while Republicans in House districts across the country that are even more Democrat have a voting record way to the right of his. So it's still a little bit unacceptable. And in the 3rd district, if we go down here to the Adrian Smith district, the current incumbent of the seat, as we see right here, he's been the incumbent for almost 20 years now, and he's really nothing special. And again, his opponent, John Walz, has been endorsed by the Nebraska Republican Party, as we can see right here. But yet another case of the incumbent way outspending the state party endorsed candidate. As we can see, Adrian Smith has spent almost $1 million here, while John Walz has not even spent $20K. So again, fundraising numbers don't mean everything, especially in primaries, but at the same time, not a good indication. Regardless, though, it will be interesting to watch the results and see if the results surprise some people and are closer than expected in this seat. Now, moving over to the last primary of interest in the state of Nebraska, we have the Republican primary for the Senate special election happening this fall, where the former governor of Nebraska, Pete Ricketts, was appointed to the seat in 2023, and now he's running for election to finish the rest of his term. And opposing him is the candidate John Glenn Weaver. He is a retired U.S. Air Force officer, and guess what? He's been endorsed by the Nebraska Republican Party. They once again bucked their incumbents that they deemed to be doing a bad job in Congress, have a poor voting record, and that turned their backs on the state party. And once again, sadly though, for the 3rd time, Pete Ricketts is outspending and outraising by a large margin the state party endorsed candidate, by the most shocking margin this time, as he spent almost $1 million in this race, and at least as of the start of this year, John Glenn Weaver has not even spent $10,000 on this race. Now, he has also gotten a lot of county Republican parties across the state to endorse him, so he has built some momentum, very much like Dan Frey in the 2nd district. So it will be interesting to see if the grassroots movement behind him is strong enough to get out enough voters to pull off a massive upset against a former governor, the current senator, in this primary. I think it's a very tall task. I would be very surprised, but it would also be an epic result for the grassroots of the conservative movement to get someone more conservative in this Senate seat. So this is definitely a key one to pay attention to. Now, moving over to the state of Maryland, we're going to take a look at the 6th congressional district. David Trone, the current representative of this seat, is retiring to run for the U.S. Senate seat in Maryland, making this an open district come November. And we can see by looking at the Democrat primary, there are so many candidates running in this race, making it a very divided field. And if we look down to the Republican side of things, the 4 main candidates are Dan Cox, the nominee for the governorship in 2022 and a former state delegate, Mariella Roca, a candidate for this district in 2022, Brenda Thiem, a former state delegate, and Neil Parrott, another former state delegate from Maryland, and a nominee for the district the last 2 times. So it might seem a bit redundant to run him again a 3rd time in a row, but he is still my endorsement in this seat. He has been endorsed by the House Freedom Caucus and by Bob Good, the leader of the House Freedom Caucus, also by Jody Heiss, who is a former really good U.S. representative from Georgia and a former member of the Freedom Caucus. Additionally, organizations that have backed him are CPAC and the Family Research Council, 2 very strong conservative organizations. And even though he has lost the last 2 times, he did pretty well in 2022, and I think he offers the best chance to win this seat, especially with no incumbent on the Democrat side running for re-election in this district. So on a policy and electability standpoint, I hope he's the nominee. Now, moving over to the state of West Virginia once again, we can look at the two congressional races happening there this fall, as both their primary elections are slated to be different levels of competitive. In the 1st District, Carol Miller is the incumbent, having won election to a first term in 2018. Her opponent in the primary is Derek Evans, a former state delegate who was also arrested for being in Washington, D.C. on the 6th day of a certain month back in 2021. And Carol Miller is very underrated in how awful she is and what a terrible voting record she has in the United States Congress. She is very weak on the issue of abortion. She is very weak on protecting the Second Amendment. And she is overall just a more moderate Republican in West Virginia, of all places, that is absolutely unforgivable. West Virginia has become one of the most Republican states in the country, if not the most Republican, as it voted for Trump by massive landslide margins in 2016 and 2020. The 1st District can certainly have a better representative than Carol Miller. Meanwhile, Derek Evans is a very conservative option, and he's been endorsed by the House Freedom Caucus. Bob Good, as I mentioned previously, is the chair of the Freedom Caucus. He's been endorsed by Republicans for National Renewal, a pretty solid conservative political advocacy group. And Carol Miller has been endorsed by the likes of the West Virginia Chamber of Commerce, not exactly inspiring confidence in her voting record to be very conservative. And if we scroll down to the fundraising numbers here, we can see that Derek Evans is keeping up. He's raised only $200,000 less than Carol Miller and has spent over $700,000, while Carol Miller has spent $1 million. So he's keeping up in the spending game, and I think he has a decent shot at pulling off an upset and knocking off the incumbent. And it would be very, very important if he does so. This is really a key race to pay attention to, and if you live in the 1st District of West Virginia and are watching this video by chance, definitely get out and vote for Derek Evans. He would be a big upgrade in that seat. Now, moving down to the 2nd District, we have the seat where Alex Mooney is currently the incumbent, but he is running to be the next senator of West Virginia, leaving the seat open. And there are 5 Republican candidates running, the most notable of which is Riley Moore, the current West Virginia state treasurer. Looking at his accomplishments as the treasurer, he's done a decent job at fighting for conservative principles, but there are definitely some questions in his past and his past associations, and also the fact that his aunt, Shelley Moore Capito, is a United States senator, and not a great one at that, and his grandfather was a former governor of West Virginia, so he has deep, deep ties to a political dynasty in the state of West Virginia, which makes him a little bit suspect. But as I said, he also has done a good job at the post of state treasurer, so this is an interesting one. This is very much an interesting one. Also given the fact that J.D. Vance has endorsed him for the seat, and Alex Mooney, as I said, the current incumbent, has also endorsed him to be his replacement. And Mooney's been a solid conservative in Congress. So this is a really tough one to say who would be the best candidate. Riley Moore has his main competition in Chris Walker, who has been keeping up with him in spending. Riley Moore has spent almost $610,000. Chris Walker has spent $630,000. So they seem to be the main 2 contenders for this district. And this is one I definitely would keep an eye on. And Chris Walker, from looking at his campaign page, seems like he would be a solid option too. But despite my hesitancies about him being part of a political dynasty and his questions about his past, his tenure as state treasurer, and the fact that he's endorsed by people like Alex Mooney and J.D. Vance, who has been by far the best senator we've had in years, I'm going to go with my gut and say I hope Moore pulls it out, and this is definitely a key race to watch this Tuesday. Now, before we get to what, in my opinion, are the most 2 important primary elections taking place this coming Tuesday, I want to take a peek at 2 elections that are at least worth taking a glance at. One of which is the primary election taking place on the Republican side in Maryland's 1st Congressional District, where Andy Harris is the incumbent representative. He is a pretty solid conservative. He's a member of the House Freedom Caucus, and he's running against Chris Bruneau, who is a political unknown in the state, but is endorsed by Boyd Rutherford, the former lieutenant governor of Maryland, which in my mind is a clear move on the establishment Republican side of things in Maryland to get rid of Andy Harris since he's more conservative. And we can scroll down here and see that he's actually funding fairly well Chris Bruneau. He's spent $50,000. Andy Harris has spent $700,000, so still a good gap between the two. But for a relatively unknown challenger, he is funding fairly well. I think Andy Harris will have no problem winning renomination, but this is one to keep an eye on, as it seems like some forces on the Republican establishment side of Maryland are putting some weight behind maybe ousting Andy Harris. And then finally, for the United States Senate seat up for re-election in Maryland this year, the incumbent three-term senator, Democrat Ben Cardin, is retiring. And he is going to be making this an open seat, and the Democrat primary is a two-horse race between Angela Alsobrooks and David Trone. And David Trone has spent $51 million in this race. Like, I couldn't even believe that when I saw it. It's an astounding figure in a political race, let alone a political primary, not even a general election. And he's outspending Angela Alsobrooks almost 10-1, as she has spent almost $6 million, which is still very respectable, but not even close to what David Trone has spent. And we can see in the polling that Angela Alsobrooks has actually taken the lead in a recent poll put together by Emerson College, but prior to that, she has not led in a single poll. So I think this race still favors David Trone, but it's one to keep an eye on of which Democrat will come out on top. From polling and different metrics that I have been seeing about the general election, it seems like Angela Alsobrooks would be the weaker nominee, but David Trone also has his own weaknesses, so it's not really super important for the Republicans whoever wins, but it will be interesting to see who does come out on top in that race. And for the Republican side, former Governor Larry Hogan, seen right here on the left, is running in this primary. He is going to be heavily favored to win the nomination, and while Robin Ficker, who is a former state delegate in Maryland, long time ago, not since the 80s, but apparently he's a perennial candidate for offices in Maryland, and a little bit of a more Trump-aligned candidate, you might say. He is running against Larry Hogan in this primary, and we can see based on the fundraising numbers, he's actually out fundraising and outspending Larry Hogan. He has spent over $4 million, that being Robin Ficker, and Larry Hogan has spent $1.3 million. But he also has almost $2 million left in his campaign fund, so you would assume that he's saving that for the general election, which is pretty wise because he has the primary mostly locked up, as we can see the polling down here. He is in the 50s and sometimes 60s in different polls, while the highest Robin Ficker is polling is around 18%. But this is still important to pay attention to see how much of the vote on the Republican side Larry Hogan gets, to see how united the party is behind him, because in order to pull off a long-shot victory in November, he is going to have to get both the establishment and the more conservative Trumpian wings of the party and the voters behind him in the state. So that will be interesting. Now, on to the top two most important primary elections happening on Tuesday, starting off with the Republican primary for the United States Senate in the state of West Virginia. And once again, this is a two-horse race between Jim Justice, the current governor of the state of West Virginia, and Alex Mooney, who we talked about previously, is retiring from the 2nd District in the U.S. House. And I really hope Alex Mooney pulls this out. Jim Justice is a former Democrat. He became Republican about 10 years ago when he was first governor. He's not the worst Republican out there, but he definitely could be more conservative on some issues, that is for sure. And Alex Mooney much more fits into that mold of a true conservative. And Jim Justice has been endorsed by Trump, which is not super surprising. They got along well when Trump was in office. He has a lot of senators behind him, a lot of Republican groups on his side. But so does Alex Mooney. He has the endorsements of people like Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, Riley Moore, ironically, returned the favor and endorsed him since he's running for his old seat. He's been endorsed by CPAC, the conservative organization Club for Growth, the West Virginia Republican Assembly, and he has been actually out fundraising Jim Justice. He's raised over $3 million to Jim Justice's $2.5 million, and he's outspending Jim Justice by almost $400,000, having spent almost $2 million, we can see here, to Jim Justice's $1.5 million. So he's keeping up, he's being competitive in the endorsements, in the fundraising game, and I wholeheartedly support Alex Mooney and hope he pulls this off. Unfortunately, the polling suggests Jim Justice has the edge, as he has been leading every single poll since this race started to be analyzed. However, if you notice something in Alex Mooney's column over here, he has started to pick up steam in recent months. And in one poll, he is only 14 points behind Jim Justice. I think this race actually has a chance to be much closer than people expect. Mooney's been campaigning a lot, he's been fundraising and spending a lot, and has just as many endorsements and people behind him as Jim Justice does. Having Alex Mooney in the Senate over Jim Justice would definitely guarantee a more conservative voting record, but arguably more important in my mind, of all the races happening, is the one for the governorship in West Virginia. There is a star-studded Republican field running for this office. You have Mac Warner, the current West Virginia Secretary of State. You have Patrick Morrisey, the current West Virginia Attorney General. And then you have two candidates who fall into the category that we've seen so far West Virginia seems to love: political dynasties and nepotism. We have Chris Miller, who is the son of Carol Miller, the U.S. representative of the 1st District in West Virginia that we talked about earlier. And then we have Moore Capito, who is the son of U.S. Senator Shelley Moore Capito, and the cousin of Riley Moore, who is the current state treasurer running in the 2nd District in West Virginia for Congress. There's so much political dynasty, nepotism, inbreeding happening in West Virginia politics, it's ridiculous. I want Moore Capito and Chris Miller nowhere near the governorship. No one should vote to continue these political dynasties. It's ridiculous. Mac Warner has been a good Secretary of State, but Patrick Morrisey is really, really solid. He has been phenomenal as the Attorney General for the past 12 years. He is really, really good on every issue that you can think of as a conservative. He is the person that I am hoping wins the nomination. And while it is because I think he's a solid pick and even an upgrade over Jim Justice, but also just because some of the other candidates are so bad, and Chris Miller and Moore Capito, they need to lose, and it would be a disaster if they get the nomination for the governorship. Moore Capito is endorsed by his mom and Jim Justice. Those are his two big endorsements. While Patrick Morrisey is endorsed by Vivek Ramaswamy, Club for Growth, the NRA, West Virginia Coal Association, much better endorsements that you would want to see for the conservative candidate in a race. And luckily, Morrisey is leading in all but one of the polls. However, we can see here, especially this poll here, he's only leading Moore Capito by 4 points, 33 to 29. It's going to be a close race. Like I said, he even lost one poll, 31 to 23 against Moore Capito. His clear challenger is Moore Capito. There was even another poll back in April that had him only beating Moore Capito 31 to 29 by 2 points. This is going to be probably the closest race of the night for all of the primaries in West Virginia, Nebraska, and Maryland, and also the most consequential. So I hope he is able to pull it across the finish line and win this race and get the nomination locked up and locked away from the elite political class in West Virginia. So, having gone over all these races, we can now put Nebraska, Maryland, and West Virginia in the column of states with some races to watch. Not battleground states, not a lot of key races to watch necessarily. But as we can see, there are plenty of crucial and competitive primaries happening in these 3 states that will determine how good of a Republican we get nominated for each office. Because with a few exceptions, the overwhelming majority of the primary races that I covered are going to go very Republican in the fall, no matter the candidate that is chosen. So you want the best conservative one being nominated. So they are the one that can achieve victory in November and will be the best served and the most likely to fight for conservative values starting in 2025 to give conservatives better representation at the state level and in Washington, D.C.